So how well do you remember things? Do you feel like your ability to remember things is just not that great? Well, don't blame your brain. Perhaps you just haven't learned the right techniques on how to remember. Learning to remember, after all, is a skill set. It can be learned. In fact, there are countless memory techniques from mnemonics to spaced repetition that aid in remembering. So in today's video, I'll go over an ancient technique that has been used by some of the greatest philosophers, learners, and memory champions, which is known as the Method of Loci, or Memory Palace. But before I do that, I appreciate if you could like this video. It really helps to educate more people. And while you're down there, hit that subscribe button so I can continue to feed you nuggets of gold that boost brain and behavior. So going into the Memory Palace, or the Method of Loci, is a mnemonic technique that leverages your spatial memory to enhance the recall of information. As both name implies, it makes use of your imagination and memory of well-known constructed location, hence the loci, and then you visualize to optimize recall. Whether that said palace is your own home or route you regularly walk through, or even just a newly imagined place, this method involves associating information to specific spots within the space. Mentioned earlier, this technique is nothing new. It's existed since ancient times. In fact, the Method of Loci can be dated as far back to ancient Greece, where the poet Simonides of Ceos just happened to develop it based on an unfortunate incident. So as the story goes, Simonides was having a banquet with some notable friends and families, where he was later called out to the banquet hall to greet some visitors. As he exited out the hall, the palace collapsed, killing everyone within it. As an attempt to recall all the fallen guests, he began to develop this method by remembering their seating order and where they remained in the hall, mentally walking through the collapsed banquet hall. Technique was used extensively by Greek and Roman orators to memorize speeches, remember information, preserve knowledge, stories, and vividly recall cultural identities. Since then, in modern times, this technique has been used in competitive memory sports where memory athletes, businessmen, language learners, students, intellects, they all leverage this method to memorize an astonishing amount of information, from memorizing thousands of digits of pi to remembering a whole list of names. What makes this Method of Loci so effective lies in its ability to convert plain information into easily retrievable, clear mental images. What it does is tap into the brain's spatial and visual memory, making the recall of information more intuitive and seemingly more tangible. It's not just an empty thought alone. Additionally, this Method of Loci can be explained with our very understanding of how memory works. So for example, when it comes to cue-dependent in forgetting, this suggests when we tend to fail at retrieving memory if there are no contextual cues we can pull from, and this is what exactly Method of Loci does. It pulls and creates specific cues. And also, creating associated visualization to an information taps into the power of chunking, which is breaking down large amounts of data into smaller, more manageable units. So looking at the science behind spatial and visual memory, spatial memory is our brain's ability to remember locations and physical layouts. It's the memory we tap into every day when interacting with our surroundings. We use it for driving, locating to a specific restaurant, walking through a neighborhood, searching for items in a store. But it's also used in movement, where we remember the layout of a basketball court, understand the pattern of movement in dance, take note of walk-through trails on hikes. Everything around us, from finding lost items to understanding where we are, this is spatial memory. This type of memory is deeply rooted in human evolution. Since ancient times, we've used spatial memory for survival and finding food and shelter. When we tie information to a spatial context, we are able to retrieve it easier. And since it's been with us for as long as we've lived, naturally your brain is hardwired to remember spatial environments. Plenty of research indicates when we actively engage multiple parts of our brain to access information, we learn and remember better. This is one of the reasons why the cognitive bias, the modality effect, is so useful in learning, as we leverage different modes of information, whether it's images, audio, video, text, to ultimately enhance memory retention. One study showed that when participants tried to retain given information using different mediums, most participants were actually able to recall about 10 to 20% of written or spoken information. But on the flip side, when you use a lot of different modalities, you're able to retain 65% of visual information. In fact, visual learning is so powerful that research indicates that it can improve learning by up to 400%. As Dr. Penny Trainor, a clinical neuropsychologist, once stated, research tells us that richly encoded memory traces are much more likely to be retained, and multimodal learning is a way for more richly encoding information. You see it, discuss it, and experience it. So by this point, you've heard the science behind it and what happens with your brain when it comes to spatial memory. Then the next question is, how do you actually get started with this? I've broken this down into 6 steps. Step 1 is to choose your palace. First, try to choose and envision what your palace will look like. You can either pick a place you know very well that is familiar to you, or you can try to construct something entirely new. Wherever the case might be, detail is key. But remember, the more familiar you are with it, the easier it will be to remember. So when you're a beginner at this, it's probably better to choose a familiar place. Step 2 is to define a route. Once you can visualize a place, create a specific route in your chosen location. Imagine yourself walking through the place clearly, from the way you move through each room to the route in which you navigate the space. Every time you return to this memory palace, the important thing is to remain consistent. Once you have a defined route, don't stray off course. Walk through the palace in the same way each time within your head. And then step 3, identify specific loci or locations. Within your memory palace, identify specific spots where you will then place the information you want to remember. Whether it's furniture, doors, objects, the key point here is to know what is where. Then step 4, once you have everything organized in your mental model of your head, associate information with the loci. After everything is clear from the route, the locations, the things, associate whatever information you'd like to learn into those locations you've imagined. This is done best by converting the information to some type of image. So for example, if you're trying to learn a different language and you have a specific vocabulary that's kind of hard to remember, let's just say mirador, which means lookout in Spanish. You can think of it as a sticker with letters placed on it and stuck to a given window by the kitchen. That way, when you make the association that every time you pass the kitchen and you look at the window, you see a sticker with the word mirador sticking out. And it kind of associates this idea of looking out through the window. Then there is step 5, which is walk through the palace. Yes, in step 2, you've defined the route, but it means nothing if you're not actively imagining and practicing walking through the palace. You need to do this over and over and over again. This is the practice that leads to perfection. You need to mentally walk through your memory palace, observing each location, the image you've placed there, the different associations that you've input, revisit and revise every time when you need it. If something is not clear to you, then try to make it a little bit more clear in your imagination. The point of this step is to repeat the walkthrough until things are super familiar. And then finally, there's step 6, which is expanding your palace. This step is a little bit more for people that are intermediate or advanced and have become more familiar with the palaces they've created. But once you've learned to do all of this in one location, you can then expand the palace by extending the rooms or perhaps creating new palaces entirely for different information. So yeah, that's really all there is to it. Of course, this does sound a bit easier said than done, and it can feel a little bit silly because everything is ultimately in your imagination. But actually sitting down, visualizing the space, drawing out the space in your head, and clearly walking through it does take time. You need to spend time doing it. You can't just imagine something and then move on. You need a dedicated effort to really carrying out this memory palace vision. It's like any skill. With enough practice, you should be able to use it to memorize information for exams, presentations, learning languages, recalling names, and so much more. So visualization techniques like the Method of Loci aren't just used by learners. In fact, Michael Phelps, the greatest Olympian of all time, has gone on record to talk about his habit of visualization to win him over 28 Olympic medals, essentially tapping into the power of visualization and spatial memory. So if you're interested to learn more about his habits and skills that he's done this, make sure to check out the next video. And if you really did find this insightful, I would appreciate a like and subscribe to this channel so I can continue to help you boost your brain and behavior.